Hey crafty people, it's Tasha. Welcome back to my channel. For today's project, I'm going to be taking some of the ephemera pieces from the My Monthly Hero February 2024 premium elements and layering up different mediums to turn them from these crisp white pieces to distressed vintage style ones. So here's a reminder of how they started and where we're going to get them to with this first layer of distressing. I'm using root beer reactive ink and a small detailed blending brush. I'm concentrating on the outside edges first as I want to cover that bright white border. So I'm just blending the ink onto here and turning the flower as I cover more of the border. I like to work on a slick surface which protects my desk from getting inky, however it also reduces the drag on my brush as I'm blending. I like to start my brush on that slick surface and begin moving in circular motions whilst moving onto the paper, and this really helps to get a smoother blend. It's also going to avoid that mark on your projects from where you set your brush down to begin with. I do have some glass mats that I like to use, but I know that not everyone has these. So I also wanted to show that I have this makeshift mat too. It's a great solution and super easy to make if you have access to a laminator. So I just ran an A4 sized laminator pocket through my machine with nothing inside it. Then I placed that inside another pocket and ran it through a second time. This gave me a pretty sturdy plastic mat, which is easy to store and to take out each time you need to use it. It's also pretty easy to clean too. Mine is stained. That was due to a previous crafty session involving alcohol inks, but that doesn't transfer, so I didn't see the need to make another one. After covering the border, I'm adding ink over the whole thing to give it an aged look and to tone down the brightness of the colours a little bit. Once I'm happy with that, I'm swiping the ink pad across the edges of each piece to really darken those up. The last bit of this stage of the distressing is to add splatters across them all. So I've got them in my little makeshift splatter box, and I'm using a paintbrush to mix some water into ink that I've pressed onto an old gift card. Then I'm using the edge of the card to just flick that ink off. This gives me a really fine splatter, and I can kind of direct it a little by moving the card round, and that helps me make sure I get all of the pieces. I'm also adding some white splatter too with some unicorn pigment ink. With both inks, once I have that fine splatter, I like to go over them all again, tapping the handle of the brush, which gives me bigger and more irregular spots too. Now I've set those aside to dry whilst I'm working on my background. Just as with the ephemera, the background is going to come together in various layers. I'm starting with the sun stencil from this month's kit, and I've got that taped to an A2 panel of strong white cardstock. I've purposely not centered the panel, and I've also got the sun, the kind of negative piece that comes with the stencil, taped into place because I don't need to ink blend over that bit too, so it just makes my job a smidge easier. I'm using a small blending brush and my favourite teal colour blend of Pool Party and Blue Raspberry. It is a large area to cover with a small blending brush, but I wanted to be sure that I could get in the whole stencil, and I was concerned that these shapes might chew up my favourite tool, that's the domed foams with an ink blending tool. As it goes, you don't actually end up seeing this first layer of colour with everything else that goes on top, but it is there, so this is how I did it. So now I've peeled away the stencil and I'm ink blending those same two reactive inks directly onto the panel using my domed foam applicator. I kept the circle stencil in place again only because I don't need ink to go there, so why waste it? Now I'm patiently applying that ink, working the colour up slowly until I got really frustrated that it was taking too long. And around the same time, I realised that I aren't necessarily looking for a perfect smooth blend here. So I went straight to paper, just getting that colour on there as fast as possible. After getting around the edges on there, I'm then working in circular motions to bring that colour in a little bit more. Then I can grab the lighter colour and go over the rest of the space. and I'm not being careful here. I'm just getting that colour on there as quickly as possible. Then I can set that aside to dry, and I came back to age it up a bit with more of the Root Beer Reactive ink. I've added the sun stencil back in place. I'm going over that with a small blending brush again. I aren't looking for an even blend here. I'm not even going over the entire stencil, and I know some areas I'm adding more colour than I did on others. I'm really just going more for texture and distressing it to fit with the ephemera pieces. Once I have that pattern on there, I'm swiping the ink pad over the edges again, giving some darker colour by swiping multiple times. I'm also allowing that ink to skip off the edge anywhere it kind of wants to, so that's giving me some really nice texture when the pad goes onto the panel itself, and it's tying in all of that brown ink blending and the edges to give a more cohesive look. Again, leaving that to fully dry. So, through the magic of editing, I'm back a bit later and I'm ready to add some more to my ephemera pieces. I've got the Novel Prose bold print, and I'm putting it into my Misty with the mouse pad taken out, and then positioning some of the ephemera, keeping within that space that the stamp covers. So I'll be doing a couple of rounds of stamping them. I'm going to ink up with Unicorn Pigment ink and stamp that down directly onto my ephemera pieces. I'll be honest, I wasn't all that sure that this was the right way to go, and I almost second guessed myself, but I'm so glad that I stuck with it, because honestly, I think this is my favourite bit of the whole project. I love the extra detail and texture that it gives to the ephemera pieces, and the white on there tones down the colours a little bit more too. It does take a little time for pigment ink to dry, and I didn't want to risk smudging them, so I set these aside, and I set them aside to dry, but you could hit them with Speed 1 on your dual speed heat tool from WoW if you want to. I wanted that writing to go over the entire piece, so I'm stamping it down onto the background panel too. Again, I'm not too concerned with having a perfect transfer, and in fact, I like that there are areas with more or less ink than other spots. I felt like I wanted to get some metallic onto here now, so I grabbed for my Foundry Wax. This is the shade Mind, which has a sort of warm copper look to it. You want to give these a really good shake before use. I haven't used these in a while, and they'd settled so much that it literally took a few minutes of shaking to hear that little ball bearing start rattling round in there. They also dry super fast, so you want to just put out a little bit at a time onto your messy surface, and then I'm using a brush to transfer some of that onto my ephemera pieces. I'm working fast because A, I don't want it to dry out before I can use it, and B, I don't want to think too much about where I'm placing it on each piece. Now be warned, this will wreck your brush for using with any other medium, so definitely don't use a favourite one. The Foundry Wax looks dull to start with and nothing special at all, but with just a few seconds of heat, it becomes this beautiful metallic. It's different than heat embossing, and it doesn't have any raise to it, it's completely flat. I went back in to add some more, a little thicker this time to give me some almost drip-like bits, so this time I just used my finger instead and let gravity start pulling that down before I set them back onto the mat. Like I said, it dries really fast, so those thicker bits don't have a chance to level out before it dries, and when I heat these again, you can see some drip-like bits. This bit was a total fail. I was trying to get some onto the panel and sort of dry brush it, but it just kept drying before I could do anything with it. It gets kind of thick and it becomes really dry from the outside in, so I did kind of scrape and push it, squash it into the cardstock to see if I could salvage any of it. I did still heat set it, and there were these chunky pieces which had come away from the cardstock entirely. I heated some of these, but a few blew away before melting, so I just swept those up and put them into the bin. Oh well, no harm done. To be fair, this all gets covered anyway. I'm tearing up a piece of vellum to give me rough, torn edges on each side. And then for even more texture and interest, I'm scrunching it up into a teeny tiny ball. I'm really roughing and creasing it up. So when I unravel it, I've got this crinkled and battered looking piece of vellum, which is absolutely perfect. I want it to look as though it's behind the whole arrangement, but I don't have a piece that was big enough, so I'm going to fake it. I'm tearing it up and getting an idea of where the edges of my flowers will roughly be before adhering these 3 separate pieces with some liquid glue. This way it looks as if it's all one piece that just goes behind the whole arrangement once all of that's in place. I did make sure to only put glue where it will be covered, because as you can see, it's very obvious where the glue has been placed, so I don't want that visible. I've got a layer of foam adhesive behind my 2 largest flowers, and to make sure I get them both exactly where I want them, I've already glued them together. Then I can place them straight down and build my arrangement out from there. I avoided adding any foam adhesive towards the edges of those 2 largest ones so that I can slip the others underneath. To avoid wasting any of the ephemera and to give me a little bit more to work with, I cut one of the ephemera pieces into 2 and I tucked each one behind those front flowers so you'd never know that it had been cut. I am loving how that beautiful arrangement is looking, and those colours work so well against that teal background. To help my heart stand out a little bit more, I'm adding more of that root beer ink to the edge. I've heat embossed a sentiment with Wow Copper, and that works really nicely with the mined Foundry Wax. I die cut it and added a second die cut behind for a little dimension. So now I'm just gluing that into place, and I have the heart popped up on some foam adhesive. I absolutely love how this one came out. It's quite different from my usual style, but I must admit I am a bit obsessed. It has me feeling super inspired and excited to play around with some more of these techniques a little bit more. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you aren't already subscribed to my channel, then please consider hitting that button, ring the bell so you're always notified. Have a lovely, happy, safe and wonderful week. Stay crafty. Bye.